Things are changing, man.
Things are changing, man. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 144. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in to our fifth session in our Training Wheels series. We just got done talking about building stable foundations for our family, and now we're moving into a conversation where we're going to talk about shepherding and shaping our kids, and where better to start than with God, the perfect father.
The perfect shepherd, the perfect shaper, the perfect everything.
Exactly.
So I think we set it up really well last time also. It's just been building towards, like, when are you going to talk about God, who's the perfect example of a father? And in a way, we're going to spend a couple weeks talking about God and his perfection as a shepherd and shaper.
It makes so much sense. And as we had a few weeks ago, we talked about this in a daily download episode that we're going to go through together here on the episode, and we called that conversation starter, We Were Experts.
This is Training Wheels.
We were experts.
Before we had kids, we were all perfect parents, at least in our minds.
Oh yeah, we were.
We'd read the books and we'd studied the parents around us. We were experts in child rearing with all the answers on what to expect when you're expecting and beyond.
Everything made sense until we walked out of the hospital with our newborn in our arms and realized we don't know what we're doing.
And it wouldn't get any easier as they grew up.
So where do we turn when the strategies don't work? And everyone has a different opinion.
It's easy to forget you have the best parenting example ever available to you. His book isn't in the parenting section, but our Heavenly Father is the only perfect parent.
So as we try to give our kids a stable foundation and shape them into the people we hope they'll become, what can we learn from God about parenting?
Here's the big idea. We can find our way in our parenting dilemmas by looking up.
Maybe you had fantastic parents, or maybe not, but your primary model can't come from them or any earthly source.
When you need illumination, consider how the Father of lights deals with his children.
Despite our failures, God constantly shows us his love. Do our kids see our love for them as clearly?
He fights for us, protects us, and provides for us.
He leads and patiently corrects us. He gives us room to choose wrong, but never gives up on us.
The Father doesn't foster our sense of entitlement by indulging our every desire, but he does give us what we need.
And sometimes what we need is discipline.
And sometimes it's grace.
God does the difficult work of shepherding and shaping us, and may we develop as parents in his image.
So here's the big question. What do you still have to learn from God about parenting?
So follow along with this guided study at BibleGeeks.fm/trainingwheels. And may the Lord bless you and keep you today.
Shalom.
Okay, I'm not going to just pat ourselves on the back, but I really like that one. So where do we go here in thinking about God, the perfect father, with this big idea?
Yeah, it really summarized a lot. I was thinking, wow, that says a lot of it more succinctly than we will on this episode.
More than likely, absolutely.
Yeah. But we've got a lot to unpack, I guess you could say. And the big idea was we can find our way in our parenting dilemmas by looking up. And those parenting dilemmas, they start showing up as soon as things don't go the way you expect. I remember we had our first crushing lesson in humility in looking to God for clarity right at the beginning. We put so much work into just trying to make sure everything was perfect. We had the perfect birthing plan.
I remember
this. We were purposeful and we were prayerful and we had it all figured out. And we would never say, look down on anyone else. But I think we realized later that we really thought our plan was the best. And then nothing went according to plan. And health complications meant we had to go to the hospital instead of the birthing center. Adrian eventually had to be medicated and get the epidural, and instead of doing things the way we wanted because of health complications. And it was our first lesson in mourning the ideal. I remember Adrian just crying because obviously it was an emotional time, but it was just letting go of what we thought we had control of and surrendering what should happen to what did happen and really trusting God to lead us through it. God is the stable constant. His parenting example, his precepts, his goodness give us the confidence and the guidance when the answers aren't as clear as we thought they would be. So what's the big question?
The big question, though, kind of leads to that same idea. Like, what do you still have to learn from God about parenting? Because if he teaches you about parenting right off the bat in learning to trust him, I think he continues to teach us. And I think it's like keys and sunglasses and like the mail. Sometimes the thing that you're looking for has been sitting in the same place the whole time, and it's right where you've been looking, but for whatever reason, you've walked past it 100 times and stopped noticing it. And I think with God's instruction, like, we study the Bible, we read about his relationship with his children, and I think sometimes we just miss the instruction, the lessons that are right there about how God is constantly leading us and how he's constantly led his people throughout all time. And I think it's tempting to look around for answers, like we talked about in that conversation starter, about other people's opinions, other people's experience, like self-help books and all these things about how to parent. But we have thousands of years of history where God gives us the answers to our modern day parenting questions. And if I could just stop myself in the moment and look to God's direction, I'd be much better off as I continue to lean on him and learn from him about how I can be a better father.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Yeah, it's just sitting right there. There's so much to learn from the things we already know when we start applying them to these, as you said, modern day parenting questions, to these dilemmas that come up, and you just think, well, what would the perfect father do?
Yeah.
WWTPD.
That's a terrible acronym, but I'm with you there. Yeah, especially as we start thinking about like all the modern day things we deal with. It's like, well, don't ever think that God's advice, God's direction on parenting is antiquated, because, I mean, he's been dealing with the things that have not been new under the sun since the sun was created by him, which is just amazing. So let's get into our first segment here on the episode, and that is Jesus Said. So here we are, we're in Matthew 7, verses 7 through 11, where Jesus has a lot to teach us about how our Father gives us good things. Again, we're looking back to God, the perfect Father, and so Jesus here has some important things to say to us about God and his relationship with us as his children. He says, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you," he says, "if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent?" Of course, that would just be ludicrous. So he says, "If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" And so, what is the main point of this passage, and what does it teach us about God?
I think the main point is that we can count on the providing, gift-giving love of God to deliver when we ask. But to emphasize that point, he talks about this parental know-how. He says, even you know how to have that gift-giving love. You who are evil, he says, know how to give good gifts to your children. What kind of know-how does that really take? What kind of evil parent would it take to give their kid a snake when they ask for some fish sticks or a rock instead of a piece of toast? And of course, that's the point. God is utterly reliable for so much more than a parent, because he loves you like a parent, and then so much more than a regular parent. He has a perfect love. But he demonstrates this gift giver's know-how that goes beyond the average parent. So much of parenting ends up in these yeses and nos and maybe next year, and these responses to a billion requests that come our way. And the big insight from God is to regularly look for the true and lasting good of our children. He never gives the harmful thing. He always gives the good thing we need, the thing that'll truly bless us. And most of our good things we didn't even ask for, which I guess you could say for our kids too. And rarely do we say thank you for all the things that he gives us. And maybe that's often true of our kids and parenting. And that's just kind of the job, because there's so much to give. There's so much that is needed for just regular life. But God remains reliable for all of this good and continues to give us, again, that lasting good thing, the things that will ultimately really bless us. There's a lot that could come from that, and maybe we'll get into more of it. But that's the thing that struck me is, you know how. This this know-how of not just saying yes and not just saying no, but being this giver of good gifts that always gives the best thing.
I kind of got stuck on the thing right before that.
Yeah.
I got stuck here on the fact that I am evil. You know,
It's like an aside.
it's like a minefield that you're going to step on in this conversation. Like, wait a second, hold on, Jesus, I'm evil? But I got stuck on that thought. Like, you ever find that common movie trope where like two characters look at each other and basically ask like, are we the bad guys here? Because the whole time they thought that they were the good guys or they thought they were doing the right thing. No one likes to think of themselves as the villains. But in comparison to God, who is the perfect Father, of course, we've all fallen short. And we might say, okay, well, of course, I've made a mistake. I've not been the best parent. I've fallen short. But am I evil? I mean, come on, that seems a little extreme. But here, Jesus is admitting that we are doing good things for our kids. Like, we do know how to do good things for our kids, like you were just talking about. But compared to God, we're pretty evil. I mean, if you just had to boil it down to something fairly straightforward, Jesus isn't mincing words here because he's trying to compare us with God, who is the perfect giver of all good gifts. And I think it's natural for us to want to try to take care of our kids, and Jesus is admitting that here, but God doesn't have our shortcomings. He doesn't have our failings. So imagine what he's capable of in gift giving for his children. And I think it's always a sobering thought for us to realize that our kids have access to this verse too. Do you realize that? Like, your kids are able to read that their father, their earthly father, is evil. And like, whoa, hold on. They should know that we are not God. We are not perfect. They should know that. And I think Jesus is making that clear here. Like, you are not perfect, and your kids need to see that too. But we're just following God's lead, the best that we can, and our kids need to also see that. They need to see that we make mistakes, we slip up, and I know we've talked about this before, but I don't think it's always a negative thing for our kids to realize that we're just human beings and that we can get real with them and say to them that we also make mistakes. We're doing the best we can, but we'll never be as perfect as God. And so we're always trying to point them to God. We're always trying to point them to the perfect Father who gives perfect gifts. And we're modeling that for them the best we can, but it needs to be very clear that we're not God, we're not perfect, we're going to make mistakes. That's why God is there, because he's always going to be able to account for those shortcomings that we have.
Yeah, you're right. I think I'm more comfortable with I'm not perfect, or,
Right.
you know, and my kids are aware, you know, or I'm flawed, or you are a father who is even deeply flawed, but evil, that's a lot. That's a lot. But there it is, again, very humbling and all the more necessary for us to realize that if we're not pointing them to the one who is good, if we're not helping them be under his influence, then we're not going to bring enough goodness to this child, this relationship, in order to put them on the right path. We need that true good. You know, any good that is in us, of course, is sourced from the Father of lights, from whom comes every good gift.
So let's get into our second segment here on the episode, and that is Deep Thoughts.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy.
So we have some deep thoughts about parenting lessons from God. And of course, throughout this episode, we've been kind of touching on a few different aspects of God and his parenting. But if you dig deep and you kind of look around, maybe what Bible stories help illustrate God's parenting best for you, take some time to reflect on all the things that you know about God as a father. What are the lessons that really stands out to you? And so let's share some of our experience with studying about God's parenting.
Yeah, there was a passage in our recommended reading for this discussion in Hosea 11, and we weren't going to talk about it anywhere else here, so I wanted to grab onto it
It's so
because
good.
I think it really is. We usually think of Hosea's picture of Israel as an unfaithful wife. That's the really defining metaphor of the book because of Hosea's own experience. But here in Hosea 11, he paints a poignant picture of Israel as a beloved child and God as the father that struggles. I mean, it really seems like God is wrestling, at least emotionally, with this experience of getting his son to walk in the right path and seeing him stray. And leading him in all the right ways. And it's a touching insight into God's heart. And as a dad, I take a lot from it. I take some solidarity with God,
Yeah.
some encouragement and hope and peace, and certainly just what an example from the way God describes the relationships. And when your kids are behaving well, making choices you're proud of, it's pretty easy to be a parent. You feel good. Like, maybe I was a part of that. That kindness, that honor, the way that they just acted honorably. But it's when they lose their way that it's so hard. And my kids are still somewhat small, but you already are starting to see, I already am starting to experience those moments where it's like, what are you doing? You know better than this,
Oh, yeah.
And in this passage, we find this love that's tender, but also strong. It's compassionate, but it's authoritative. It's unyielding in its desire for good, for the good of the son, but it's affirming his right painfully to ultimately make his own way, even if that alienates him from his father. So he says in Hosea 11, verse 1, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And then out of Egypt, I called my son. But this sounds familiar too. The more they were called, the more they went away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, for me, it's an experience of just light frustration. Like, get over here. Hey, and you're calling their name. And where are you going? I just said your name. I just had that happen to me the other day. And I just couldn't believe it. Like, I've trained you better than this. What are you doing? And it's like, he didn't even process that I was calling his name or something. But this is about a true departure. He's calling them. He's calling their name. And the more he calls them, the further they go into Baal worship. But he says in verse 3, but yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. They didn't even know who it was that was making everything okay for them, And he says in verse 4, I led them with cords of kindness. I expect to hear the cords of a whip, but no, he says, I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them, fed them. I mean, he's leaning down. He's like getting down on his knees or crouching down to be close to them on their level and give them everything they need. But they're not hearing them, and they're turning from them. And so he is going to bring discipline on them. But he says in verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I let you go, right? He's just so overwhelmed with his love for them that it's not enough to let him just give up and walk away. He says, my heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning desire. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. There's the perfect Father. He's not evil like you people,
Yeah.
He's not evil like us. He is the Holy One. And so he's going to respond in this perfect balance of fierce anger and righteousness and indignation and discipline, but also in this kindness and mercy and this patience. And so ultimately, there's this lovely picture. And at the end of verse 10 and verse 11, he says, his children shall come trembling from the west. When he roars, they shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. It's just this hopeful picture. There's going to be a remnant. There are going to be some who will turn back. And of course, God doesn't need hope. He knows the future. And he just holds out with his understanding that there will be some who come back, and he's going to receive them with all the patience and love that anyone ever could whenever they do. And so that's, my biggest takeaway, I guess, is that gentle but unyielding leadership. But it's also beautiful to find this way that he looks ahead. He knows some of his wayward kids will turn back. The way he describes them returning trembling to their father's voice. But may my compassion as a dad grow warm and tender. May I, as we talked about last week, lead with the cords of kindness, the bands of love, and become as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. What a wonderful Father we have to imitate. What a great example. And I just couldn't go without turning to this passage that brings all the deep thoughts on its own right here from Hosea's words.
Yeah, you just kind of had a cop out there and just relied
I
on
just skidded along
Hosea
on
11.
his depth. Yeah.
No, but I think it's important for us to see how God experiences frustration. I mean, we kind of talked about it briefly a few times, but like Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2 is a verse that always stands out to me, where it says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." But I think as we tend to do so often, like we sometimes like to weaponize verses against parents and think like, okay, well, if your children don't turn out well, then you must be an unfit parent. But like, how do we view God as a parent? He's the perfect father, and he's done everything he can for his children that we see here in Hosea, that we see in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2. He's done everything he can as a father. He is not a deadbeat dad. He's not unfit as a parent. He is the perfect father. He's done everything, but it's always up to the kids who make their own choices. And so I feel like we see here God, as you were talking about, he's doing everything he can. He's trying to turn them back. He's patient with them, but it's always up to them. It's always their choice. As much as he would want to take control, he's got to let them come back to him.
Yeah, he leads, and it just seems like there's this point where even as he has these cords of kindness and these bands of love that he's pulling them along on, there's this point where they have the ability to just break away. It's a very challenging idea of parenthood, the idea of our kids' failure. I mean, we're going to be spending some time talking about this.
Yeah.
Our own failures, we've talked about. Our kids' failures is another painful idea, and the difficulty that they'll face. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a picture of such grace, I think is a word that I didn't mention earlier, that comes to the surface as you look at that Hosea 11 picture as a whole.
And that's kind of what I focused on here too in my deep thought, was how patient God is. I guess we all kind of picked a challenging moment in which God teaches us something that we need to learn. Maybe that says something about what we're currently dealing with, but I don't know. As I was thinking about long road trips, and we only have one daughter, and so there's not a lot of like sibling fighting in the back seat going on. That's typically not the case in our family. But if you spend a lot of time with your kids, especially on a long road trip, especially with their questions about, are we there yet, and everything else, like it's so easy to go a little stir crazy when you're dealing with whatever's going on back there that your kids are up to. And so I think it's amazing to read the story of Exodus as I was thinking about this question of what do we learn from God's parenting? The fact that God was so patient on this great road trip from Egypt to the Promised Land, and how he's leading them, he's bringing them there, he's doing everything he can for them, but they're constantly testing his patience like those little kids in the back seat. Like they complained about the food, they complained about the accommodations, they didn't think that they were going to make it to their destination alive. And if you've ever been driving with kids, you know that they don't think they're going to make it there alive. And yet, God continues to lead them. He still drives the car. And I think we sympathize with God and what he went through there as parents when he talks to Moses and says, "How long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them. And I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." That's in Numbers 14, verses 11 to 12. You can see God is like at the end of his limit. He's done. He's about ready to pull over the car and just get out and never come back. And
just leave them there.
Leave them there.
On the side of the road.
And listening to Moses, though, Moses pleads on their behalf there in the remaining verses of that chapter. And then we see how God relents, which, I don't know. I mean, there's so many lessons in that, but like, he wanted to punish them. He did eventually punish them still. He wouldn't allow them to go into the Promised Land after their complaining and their lack of faith. But, it wasn't nearly as severe as what he had originally planned. And so as I think about God and the way that he deals with his children and the challenging relationships that he has with them, am I willing to remain patient and level-headed like God? Do I listen to reason when maybe my spouse is trying to get me to see, to calm down or whatever, like we were talking about on the last episode? Am I thinking of the long game with my kids rather than just reacting to every little slight that might be going on in life. And God's patient with me. And that should teach me all I need to know about being patient with my daughter and maybe us with our kids. I think we have a lot to learn about patience as we see God just waiting for his people to do the right thing.
It makes me think of that Greek word for patience. We've talked about this on our Fruit of the Spirit series, but it has to do with this long temper, macrothumia. And it's this idea of having this long fuse, this long temper that you're not going to go off quickly, and you just deal with it and you keep working with it, and you're able to keep stretching out the time as long as you need to so that you're not reacting. You're not flying off the handle. Your decisions are ultimately the best ones they could be. And here God, I mean, there's this back and forth here with Moses, which is really interesting because it gives you an insight into it's very relatable.
It's so relatable.
I mean, I've never wanted to strike pestilence down on my kids, but I've never had a nation of people that I had done so much for that were turning on me like this. And you can just see God. Of course, God knows what the end of this conversation is going to be. He knows the whole thing, but he gives us this window into how exasperating it is to do so much for a people and love them so much and bless them so much and have them not respond at all as if they understand any of what's happening to them.
Maybe that leads me to think about my next response to my daughter in a challenging moment. Maybe I should just tell her that I will strike you with pestilence. Maybe that would work. I don't know. Oh, man. Okay, so let's get into our third segment here on the episode, and that is our reach out question. Reach out and touch someone. So I think you have the question this week, and that means I guess I have to answer it first. Woo!
You do. Well, this one isn't too challenging.
No.
It's how has God's leadership affected you as a parent? And I guess in a way we've been talking about this throughout, but this isn't just about his example. How ultimately has God leading you affected you in your relationship with Ashlyn?
Yeah, I think as many times as I see how God's love is demonstrated, I think that teaches me about proving my love. And we talked about it recently here on the episode where, I was saying how easy it was for me to hug my daughter and tell her I love her and all these things. I mean, I think about the thing that I tell her every single night before she goes to bed. I say, love you, dude, sleep good. And I probably tell her that I love her more than I ever heard it growing up from my dad. Not to say that my dad never told me he loved me, but I say it all the time. And I think while it's important for me to tell her that I love her, am I showing her how much I love her? Because though my dad didn't say I love you very often, he certainly showed it. And God absolutely shows his love for me and how he puts that love into action. I mean, he sacrificed his only son for me. He blesses me greatly, continually, all the time. He counsels, he guides me through all my difficulties. He's patient with me in all the ways that I can think about how God demonstrates his love for me, how I wouldn't even know what love was all about if it wasn't for God. How does that impact me as a dad? I'm learning more and more that it's not just about what I say. It's how I demonstrate that love. I want to spend more time with my daughter in her world. I want to listen more to her stories, connect with her more, understand what's going on in her world more, invest in that relationship in new ways, especially as she gets older. You go from that 9, 10, 11-year-old girl, things are changing, man. And it's I don't even know what's happening. And so every day you're having to figure out what is life with a preteen girl going to be like today? And so, what is love if I'm not demonstrating it? Probably not really love at all. If I'm not demonstrating it, I'm really not the kind of loving father that I want to be.
Yeah. Things are changing, man.
Things are changing, man.
Yeah. I was thinking about that tonight with my 4-year-old, just turned 4, that she came to the room while I was trying to prep here, and we had an exchange, and she needed help finding a plush toy or something. And then I said, I love you. And she said, love you too, Dad, or something like that, and walked away. And I was thinking, does she know what does she think that means? What does that mean to her?
Yeah.
And it's a good thing to hear. I heard that a lot from my dad. There was this refrain, and it was at first it was just something that didn't, it was just something that was said, and then it's like, be safe, here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, be safe. And you hear it enough, and then eventually you realize there's a reason that that's the thing they're saying all the time. And I love you was kind of like that. Like, he really wants me to get this and to hear this. But as important as that is to hear, like you said, it's not really the thing that's going to create that connection and that stability and shape them in the ways we want to shape them. It is, one, not doing the things that are destructive, that aren't loving, as 1 Corinthians 13 kind of shows us. And then two, like you said, creating that connection. I really like that. Really spending that time, them knowing how invested you are, knowing that nevertheless, even though you did this, it doesn't change this about our relationship. I'm going to correct you. I'm going to direct you in the right way, but that doesn't change it. I was thinking about faith and just having faith. I guess it goes with that stability idea, that God's leadership really has helped me. We started off with that story about the birthing scenario, that situation that didn't go as I wanted it, and as my wife really expected it to go, and we had it all figured out. And you mentioned last week the enormous responsibility that most of us understand. I mean, pretty much everybody acknowledges parenting is this big job. It's affecting people's whole life. Everyone on TV shows seems to be completely messed up and blame their parents. Oh, it must be my mother. It must be my father. It's like all about, like, your whole life is working through the thing that your mom or your dad did wrong, it seems like. And we're just so affected by it. And we recognize how important we are and this job is. It could be overwhelming. And it's happening all the time. It's not like you go in for an 8-hour day and you clock out of parenting. You're just in the daily moments. There's just this parenting that's happening all the time. So how do we keep a sober focus and keep taking it seriously, but not getting overwhelmed? And I think that's where faith comes in. Faith that he's there to help me, gives me peace. Faith just changes every challenging scenario into a lesson, a crossing, an opportunity, a trial that he'll lead me through. And that's huge in a job like this, where you just need to know you have somebody who's going to get you through it and help you. And it's not going to be catastrophic as long as I'm continuing to turn to him and rely on him and prayerfully try to follow his way and point the kids to him.
I think that's a game changer. I can't, and we've talked about this before, but I can't imagine how people live life in times of such uncertainty and turmoil and everything else without faith. And then how do people parent their kids without that faith and that trust that there's someone in control above what you know or can manage yourself? And to know that I can trust God and I can bring things before him and I can cast my cares at his feet and trust that he's able to help me and lead me. And if I couldn't do that, I mean, I would be in the library looking at every self-help book, parenting book, advice book on how to do whatever. I'd be seeking out all that kind of information because I'd have nowhere else to go. I'd have nowhere else to get it from. And looking to God as the perfect father, I mean, trusting in him, that changes everything, really.
Yeah, like you said, it's the source. We talked a couple weeks ago maybe, about just how it's easy to get lost and you need a compass, you need a map, you need someone, you need a guide, you need it's a Sherpa? Is that the mountain guide?
Yes, you need a Sherpa.
You need someone, yes.
We're climbing Mount Everest.
Yes. And so, I mean, it's just so easy to get lost, and you need somebody to be with you and pointing to the right direction. And people, I can only imagine how desperate people must get for that, with that, because I am, and then I find my way back to faith. And of course, I also have great examples all around me and people we can talk to, but most of the time it's just about returning to the one who is always, as we keep saying, always good and right. And even when I don't understand, I know that he's leading me where I need to go.
That's a good way to sum that all up. All right, so let's wrap up this episode with a challenge that we can all do together.
I am ready to face any challenges that might be foolish enough to face me.
Yeah, so the challenge is to explore a quality of God's parenting with a new or expecting parent. I really like this. I saw this and I immediately thought of those newish parents that I know. Not a ton of them, but I had a conversation with a friend, a young mom recently, just kind of between the pews of church after services, where I told her about just how challenging it was having a crying baby in church. We were talking about just how those dilemmas. Do you take them out? Do you keep them here? I want them to learn to be in the seat, but I don't want to disrupt anybody. But maybe when I get up 4 times, that's also disrupting. And how do I, we're kind of removed from that. But I remember that was a real dilemma. We always sat up front, and before I knew it, she was crying, and then I was tearing up, and then my wife came up and joined in, and it was just this meaningful conversation. And I think we all need mentoring that frees us from our fears of judgment and lets us talk about this stuff openly, about parenting. I think this prompt, learning from God as a parent, it's like this wonderfully lightweight and open-ended way to get started in a good conversation with a new or expecting parent.
All right, so let's close out this episode with a prayer. The suggested prayer in the study guide that you can download yourself in the show notes for this episode is, Dearest Father, help me to follow your example of leadership and love. And that's based on 1 John 3, verses 2 to 3. So we'll incorporate that in our own prayer as we close this thing out. Let's pray. Holy Father, what a privilege to call you Abba, Father, to know you as adopted sons and daughters. We know that we don't deserve the inheritance that you've prepared for us, but we're so grateful for the way that you lead us and the way that you love us. Thank you for providing for us and correcting us as your children. We ask for courage and insight as we follow your example of leadership and love. We plead for our little ones, that they would look through us to see you living within. Bless us with strength to reflect your character in our homes as we trust you to build stability and to shape our children into your image. We thank you for another day to make a difference in their lives, and we beg forgiveness for all the ways we've failed to take that job seriously. Be with us always. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so our 6th guided study session will be on the next episode here in our Training Wheels series, and we're going to be talking about example and influence as we continue this conversation of shepherding and shaping. And really, the episode is actually kind of a mirror image of this conversation where we were talking about God, the perfect Father, as we're going to start looking at Jesus, who was also kind of the perfect Father, although he never had his own children. So we'll talk about that on the next episode. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, I think, based on that conversation starter that you probably have already seen, so you probably already know where we're going. So if you haven't already prepared, you might want to read John chapter 1, verses 35 to 51, John chapter 10, verses 7 to 18, and Matthew 28, verses 16 to 20. Those verses should help you get ready for that next conversation.
Yeah, I think this is where we'll dive in also more than a lot of the episodes into the idea of discipling our kids.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting topic also. So I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice or at BibleGeeks.fm/144. You can also feel free to share these conversations with a friend. And if you want to download the study guide, the printable material for this conversation, check them out in our show notes or go to BibleGeeks.fm/training wheels, where we have all these things collected together. And then at the end of the whole series, we'll have a downloadable PDF for you to print out and have these conversations at your own leisure. Until next week, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.